Let's talk about sexual poetry and social protest. That's the title that I gave to the first sermon in this Swipe White series that we're doing at Commons right now. We're talking about sexuality. We're talking about how, as human beings, we really engage our sexuality as full persons with minds and bodies and souls. What does it mean for us to be fully integrated when we think about our sexuality? And we do that in healthy ways. But one of the things that we've been doing in this series is looking at this famous poem called the Song of Solomon. Sometimes called the Song of Songs, and we've been looking at how this book in particular is actually a form of social protest that is challenging the sexual status quo of the day. And that's been in the sermons, but I wanted to put together a little of a primer, pull out some of those ideas from the series and talk about them here on YouTube if you're interested in it. So let's look at where this idea comes from, that the Song of Songs is social protest. And the first thing is to understand that this book sometimes gets referred to by two different titles, the Song of Solomon and then the Song of Songs. And that's because the actual first verse of the poem is a song of songs which concerns Solomon. Now, we shorten that into two things, either Song of Songs, which is a superlative, saying this is a beautiful song, a good song. There's actually Jewish commentary in the Talmud that says this is the best of the Hebrew songs, or Song of Solomon because it concerns Solomon. What this doesn't mean is that Solomon wrote this book. That's probably the one thing it absolutely does not mean. It was not written by Solomon. You may have heard that before. Probably not true. It can mean a couple of other things, though. It could mean that this was a poem written in tribute to Solomon. So a court poet or someone who wanted to gift the king with a poem wrote this and gave it to Solomon in tribute to Solomon to honor Solomon. That may be true. That's a reading that goes back a long ways. But one of the most interesting ways of reading this opening line actually goes way back into an early Jewish thought. But it's the idea that this poem is actually an indictment of Solomon. You see, when you read the Song of Solomon, what you see is this incredibly beautiful poem about raw sexuality expressed in mutuality and love, and that seems to be entirely the opposite of everything that we know about Solomon's sexuality. Solomon, of course, very famous for his wisdom, but also pretty famous for some of his folly, because we are told in the books of the Kings that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, wealthy men in that day, particularly the king, could basically marry whoever they want, and Solomon obviously did that. But there would also be women that he couldn't marry, maybe for religious reasons, social reasons, political reasons. And these women would be brought into his courts as concubines. They didn't have the status of a wife, but they would still be employed for sexual purposes by the king. An incredibly oppressive, incredibly exploitative use of women in that world. And so here you have this poem about beautiful, raw, mutual sexuality dedicated to the king or concerning the king who lives everything but that. This book, then, is social protest that stands in dissent with all of the praise and all of the admiration of Solomon. It stands in our scriptures to say, this is wrong and there is another way for us to live our sexuality. But we can go even deeper with this, because one of the really interesting ideas early in the book is when this woman introduces herself. She says, I am darkened and yet lovely. Now, really problematic passage. Lots of stuff we have to unpack here. But what the root is this woman talking about the economic disparity between her and her lover. She has been forced to work in the vineyards and her skin has been darkened by the sun because of that. She's not talking about racial categories here. Remember, everyone in this book is brown. They're not white. So there is no distinction here between being dark and light in terms of white or black or white and brown. These are all people from the same ethnic group, but some of them, their skin has been weathered, has been darkened by working in the fields because they are poor. Others have been inside, living off of the wealth generated by those who are out working really hard. This woman comes from that social group. She has worked hard in the fields. She is poor, but in the story, it is her who pursues her rich lover, who takes the active posture in pursuing the man that she loves and convincing him to come away with her. Again, we see the exact opposite of everything we know about Solomon and his court and his sexual experiences. It's a poor woman who pursues her lover. It's a poor woman who takes the active role. It's a poor woman who convinces the man to run away with her. Everything that is the opposite of Solomon, who brings probably poor foreign women into his court to be used for his sexual purposes and still not given the status of wives in the court. Everything about this book is an indictment of the sexuality we see expressed in the privilege and the power of men like Solomon. This is a book that is telling us we can do better than the sexuality that's been handed us. In fact, we are called to challenge the sexual ethical status quo of our day, to find better ways, more inclusive ways, more mutual ways of expressing our sexuality. Now, back to the question of this woman who is dark but lovely. This is a really problematic passage when we then translate that into English, because dark, light, white, black, in English, these are not just descriptors, they're not just colors, they're also ethnic categories, racial categories. And so we have to be really careful with how we translate these phrases. Eugene Peterson in The Message goes with the translation, "I am weathered but lovely." And in that, he's trying to get back to this idea of the economic disparity and get away from the racial category. But Loris Wilkins Lawrence, who is a black woman, who is a biblical scholar, argues that really probably the best way to translate this is the way that the NRSV does, which is, "I am black and beautiful," for a couple reasons. First, because we can't get away from the racial categories in our English language, so we should embrace them in our translation, but also because that vav in Hebrew, that conjunction there in the phrase, can be and or it can be but. And yes, she is contrasting her economic disparity with her lover, but as you go on and you read her poetry, she actually is quite proud of her hard work. She's quite proud of her beauty, even though it may not look like the stereotypical expressions of beauty in her culture. She really is saying here, "I am dark, I am black, and I am proud and I am beautiful. And this is what gives me the courage to pursue the man that I love, to pursue the lover that I am not supposed to be able to access because of my status, to convince him to follow me because I take control of my sexuality, my economic status, my place in the world, and I demand respect for who I am." It's a really quite beautiful poem when we begin to dig into it, when we uncover the layers of social commentary that's happening in the ancient world, but also begin to understand the layers of social commentary that relate to us today. So for us, what do we do thousands of years later reading the Song of Solomon? I think we continue to look at the sexual ethic that has been handed to us, and we begin to look for the ways that we are conditioned to accept what people with power and privilege and prestige tell us we are supposed to accept. And we begin to look underneath that for all the ways that people are oppressed, they are abused, they are put into categories and given less than full autonomy over their bodies and their sexuality. And we begin to work to uncover more just, more ethical, more true ways of embracing our sexuality as human beings. Ways that understand that we should not be ashamed of our bodies. We should not be ashamed of the categories people have placed on us. We should not be ashamed of our sexual desire, but we should find ways to express that, not in ways that please the power and the privilege that surrounds us, but in ways that create real mutuality within our sexual relationships. In this way, we honor each other as human beings. We honor ourselves as full humans with brains and bodies and souls, and we move towards the sexuality that the biblical story is inviting us step by step, small movement by small movement, to embrace and embody in our lives. The Song of Solomon as sexual poetry that embodies social protest, a poem that calls us to do better than what we were handed and to challenge the status quo around us to find new ways to be sexual beings. Might your sexuality begin to honor who you are as a person, and in that may it glorify the God who created you exactly as you are.